So for this objective, I am going to walk you through a tour of the RStudio workspace. You're going to download a sample R Markdown file uh, and work through that with me and make some edits to it. So RStudio, as a reminder, is the software tool that we are going to be using throughout the semester in which we're going to write our code and explore data. And R Markdown is a file format that we'll be using to write inside of RStudio. So before we open up RStudio and I'll give you a look around, the first thing we need to do is download the Markdown file that we're going to be using as we work through this portion of the lab. So if you go back to the web page that we've been working on, just above, you should see this link. Right-click to download the file Lab01 workbook. So if you left-click and click on it, it'll just pull it up as a text file, which is not what you want to do. You want to right-click, save link as. So again, right-click, save link as. And we are going to save it inside of our repo. So what I want you to do here is find the repo you've created for this course. It's probably on your desktop. It should be called SM or your initials 2020 Fall Data Journalism. And we're going to create a new folder inside of it. If you're on a PC, this is going to work similarly, but this is on a Mac. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this folder Labs. And then inside of this folder, I'm going to create a folder, folders inside of folders, Labs 01. And then I'm going to save this file as an R Markdown file. So go ahead and save it. And if we go to our repo folder, we should now have a folder called Labs. Inside of that, a folder called Labs 01 and a folder called Lab01 workbook.rmarkdown. Okay, so now we are going to open up RStudio, and I'll give you a look around here. So in our applications folder in a Mac, this is something you could also move into your dock, or on a PC, you could make a shortcut to it on your desktop. Here it's called RStudio. It's this little blue R, blue circle with an R in the middle. And I'm just going to double click. And when it pulls up, it's going to pull up something like this. So what is RStudio? So RStudio is a software tool in which we are going to write our code inside of files called R Markdown files. And we're going to use it to load data, to clean data, to analyze it, to visualize it, and ultimately produce data notebooks that we can share with readers or editors that we can use to help guide our reporting. So I'll explain all the pieces of RStudio first, but the first thing I want to do is get the I want to get this file open, this Markdown file. So I'm going to go to my desktop. So down here on the left, this is like a file explorer. It allows you to navigate through the file system on your computer. So in my desktop, I have a repository, my repo, that is called SM 2020 Fall Data Journalism. So I'm going to click in there. And we can see the files that we have been working in. So there's my gitignore, here's my license, here's my README, here's the labs folder I just created, Labs 01. Here's the Lab01 workbook.rmarkdown, and I'm going to open that up. Okay, so 4 principal parts here of the R Markdown setup that you're going to be working in throughout the semester. So up in the upper left quadrant is the Markdown file we're working in. And Markdowns files are combinations of text and code that we use to load, clean, analyze data. This is some information about the document at the top, and then the content of this file is below. And I'll go through this in a second. You're going to work through this with me. This is called the console. So we write our code inside of these R Markdown files. But when we run it, where it's technically running is this thing called the console. And it's essentially a way of interfacing with the R language in a text format. Um, uh, and I'll show you how this code runs in the console in a second. Um, Over here on the left, it's our file explorer, as I was explaining. There are some additional elements that we'll go through throughout the course of the semester, but you can look at visualizations you've created here. Under packages, it gives you a list of easy way to access code that's been written by other people to make your life easier. We'll be going through a lot of packages throughout the course of the semester. The help file has some, you can search for things if you get stuck. It's kind of useful. More about that later. And then up here on the left is another series of windows. For the moment, there's nothing here. It's empty. But as we load some data and look at it, this is where we'll see information. We can also make connections to databases and things like that. And there's a way to access some tutorials here too. Okay. As we go through this portion of the video, you should be having RStudio up. You should have this workbook up. I'm going to walk through this document, and you should follow along with me and do the things I do. When we come to a portion of the file where you see the word task written with 2 asterisks around it, which is the sort of like R Markdown way of making text bold. That's a signal that you will need to do something, to write some code of your own, or to run something. Okay. So up at the top here, what are we looking at? We're looking at just some sort of meta information about this Markdown. The name of the file, who wrote it, the date, when we want to, finish it and like publish it, what format is it's going to come out? It's going to come out as an HTML document. Just as an aside, the web page that you're seeing here that you're using for that you're using to work through this lab was created by me using an R Markdown document that I clicked a button at the end to do what's called knitting it out as an HTML document. So this is an HTML document that was created using this R Markdown methodology. So R Markdown, this is a file that is a combination of text and code, and we'll be using this to create data notebooks this semester. We'll use it to load and clean and analyze data, and eventually you'll learn how to do what I did here, which is publish this out as a web page. There's a link here where you can read more about R Markdown. You can do all kinds of complicated things in it, including producing entire books using Markdown, if you choose to go that far. What are we looking at here? So there's 2 pieces. There's text and there's code. So these right here, the 2 hashtags or 2 pound signs followed by the word text. This is a heading. In the same way that like on this page that I created this HTML document, this is a heading. If you've ever written any HTML code, you might be familiar with like H2 tags or H3. This is the equivalent of an H2 tag. There's 2 pound signs, 2 hashtags, so it's an H2. If I had 3, it would be H3. One note about R, I just made a change to this document, and you'll notice that this turned red and has an asterisk next to it. It needs to be saved. It indicates there's a change. So if you want, just go ahead and save it with Command S, or you could always go up to File and save it that way. So this is a heading, and this is just regular text. So, and I like to combine text and code in the same document because it allows people to see our results and our findings, but it also allows people to see the context necessary, any caveats we have about the data, where we got the data, what our principal findings are, along with the code. So that's text. It's headers, styled text, and regular text. So within R Markdown, we write code in something called a code block. So this gray portion here is an example of a code block. These are special sections of the document that we create that are set up to execute code. So this one here is an empty code block. Um, we create code blocks in our document by 3 tick marks. So tick, tick, tick. And the tick is in the upper left corner of the keyboard. This is not an apostrophe. And it's located like under the escape key or the tilde key. That's on a Mac keyboard. I believe it's in the same place on a PC keyboard. And then we put this curly brace here and the letter R in a curly brace. And this tells the program that we are going to write some R code and to evaluate it, to run it as R code. So I'm just going to delete some of these ticks so you can see me create one of these. So now it's gone. Now there's nothing but like text there. So when I do 3 tick marks, bracket R bracket, and then I close it or end it, bracket R bracket. So you'll notice when it created that, it created this nice little green play button, and I'll explain what that is. This is going to be one way we run code that we put inside of these code blocks. There are other ways too. We can use this thing up in the menu up here that says run. Okay, so I'm gonna show you your first bit of code here. So this code block below contains one very simple line of code, a function that prints out my name. So again, we've got these 3 tick marks and the curly brace R curly brace, and then 3 tick marks. And then inside of it is what's called a function. So a function is a specific set of instructions that takes some kind of input and does some kind of output. So in this case, this function is called print. And the function here knows to print in the console, or like display or publish, whatever I put in it. So inside of it, I put my name, and so the input is my name, and the output is, when I press this little play button here, it prints it out below. Very easy. If I said the word hello here instead of my name, it would then print the word hello. So one thing to know here, by the way, is in these R Markdown documents, in these R Markdown documents, it's printing out like below. This is kind of handy, but where it's actually printing is in this thing called the console. So anytime we're running code that we're storing inside the Markdown document, it's actually executing. The place where the magic is happening is actually inside this thing called the console. So sometimes you may find it useful to actually execute some code directly in the console. I find those things to be really rare for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about as we go on through this course. It's a much better idea to put all of our code inside of reproducible script files like this R Markdown document. But just so you know, you can print or write any function inside. So inside the console. So I'm just going to print Sean Mussenden, and it prints in the console. It didn't, print up here. Okay, so follow along with me. Go ahead and print that out. Maybe make a change to it and print it out, and then we'll go on to the next step. So we can put text outside of code blocks, and that's a really important thing to do because it, helps us explain our code and adds context, helps people understand what we're doing. But we can also put code text inside of code blocks as long as we format it in the proper way, so that R, the language, knows not to evaluate it inside of the block. So for example, this is the exact same code block as existed above. But in this case, what we see here is that I've added a one-line comment, and the comment starts with a hashtag. Doesn't matter how many I have. I can put 1,000 or whatever, as long as there's one at the beginning of the line. And I'm just explaining what I'm doing here. This particular function prints out my name. And I know it's pretty obvious, like the function's called print, there's my name. It seems kind of basic on what it does. But as we get more complicated and go throughout the semester, you will find it's helpful not just to people who may be reviewing your code in the future, but also doing your future you a favor. If you don't look at a script file for a couple months and then come back and look at it and think, what the heck am I trying to do here? it helps to have these comments. So I'm going to encourage you to liberally comment throughout the semester, all of your code files explaining what you're doing. So if we run it, it prints this out. The fact that it's a comment knows to ignore it. So go ahead and run this block along with me, and pause the video if you want to mess around with this. I just want to show you an example of what happens if we don't format that comment properly inside of the code block. So in this case, I have a code block. It's got that same print statement, but inside of it, what I haven't done is, this is a comment, but I haven't put a hashtag in front of it. And when I run it, I get this error. And I know it's an error in a couple ways. The first is I get this red line here, and I get an error below. The R is telling me, here's what you did wrong. And sometimes it has really descriptive, helpful information. And sometimes it doesn't. But what's actually happening here is that R is trying to evaluate this as a line of code, even though it's pretty clearly not. It's just, if it's inside of a code block, it's going to try that. So if I put a hashtag here, now it knows to evaluate it, just the print statement. Just a note here, another way you knew something was wrong is there was this little X here, unexpected token function, unexpected token out, unexpected token name. You may not know what any of that stuff means right now. I'm not sure I precisely know exactly sort of what it means. We know something's wrong, and I've learned over time that, oh, this is some text. I do want to say that it's pretty routine. You're going to see these kind of errors as you code, and not just because you're learning. Getting errors as you're trying to do something and then trying to debug it is a huge part of learning to do data journalism. Even advanced data journalists, people who've been doing this stuff for years, get bugs all the time, and it is a key skill to develop. It doesn't mean you're doing something wrong, is the important thing. Getting bugs and then trying to figure out what they are, often a good first step is taking this and plugging this into Google, looking at some websites called like Stack Overflow, are good, can help lead you in the right direction. So when we talk about, the community of data journalists helping each other, this is a big part of it. So go ahead and uncomment and comment this line out and then run that. Okay, so now there's a task just for you. I'm not going to do it for you. In this empty code block below, I want you to write the function to print out your own name and run it. And I want you to include a comment inside the code block that explains what you're doing. If you get an error, you can compare to what I did on line, starting on line 38, and I think we're down to 42 now, and copy that. But go ahead and do that on your own. Pause the video when you get it. Do it right. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next step here. And we are going to load some data so that I can show you some additional features of RStudio. So what we're going to do here is we're going to load a very simple data set from the New York Times COVID-19 data tracking project. So I'm just going to pull up a link here. So the New York Times has a project where they've engaged dozens of journalists who are gathering information from health departments across the country on the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths. They're aggregating that information. They're using it for their own reporting, but very nicely on GitHub, they have released a repository that contains all of that data available for journalists to make use of. So we're going to read in one of these files so that we can examine it in RStudio. And I'll just show you where we're going to be pulling this from. So we're going to be pulling in a data set of state level information. And it represents the state of play with COVID in a particular state on a particular date going back to January. For the purposes of today, it's not incredibly important that you know the ins and outs of this data. What we're trying to do here is just show you how to essentially load it in. But this is essentially what it looks like. So for each state on each date, dating back to January 21st, the number of cases and the number of deaths as tabulated by the Times. So for the state of Washington, there's an entry on the 21st and the 22nd and the 23rd of January. As we go down through in more and more states, the pandemic started to spread. There's additional dates for each state. So each row represents the state of play on a given day in a given state, with the number of cases and deaths cumulative up through that date, which means that, say, on January 27th in California, there had been a total of 2 cases detected dating back to the beginning of the pandemic. Okay, so this data is stored in a very common data format. This here probably looks like what you're used to if you've seen a spreadsheet before, perhaps working in Google Sheets, perhaps working in Excel or something like that. A CSV is like the sort of more raw version of that, in which each row is represented on a new line, and commas are separate. Columns are separated by commas. So date, here's the header row. The first entry is date, then state, then the FIPS code, which is a unique identifier for each state as a number of cases and deaths. And each column is separated by a comma. And in fact, that's what CSV stands for. It stands for comma separated values. So we'll see this over and over again throughout the course of the semester. And most of the data we'll be working with this in class is organized into a series of rows, where each row represents something we're measuring, and then each column, which of these vertical columns, represent some feature of that thing that we're observing. Okay, so I've written a code block here for you, and this code block, what it's doing is it's doing a couple things, some new concepts, and what I would say is for right now, by the end of within the first couple weeks, what we're doing here will be sort of old hat to you. Right now it's new, so I'll just explain what's happening here. So we are creating a new object, a thing. We're giving this thing a name that's called COVID state current. And we're assigning some value to it. That's what this little arrow with a hyphen means. And the thing we're assigning it to is we're using a function that's built in as part of base R, part of the core R package, called read.csv. And what are we reading in? We're reading in a CSV. And where is this CSV located? Well, here's the URL for it. We're saying, go out to the internet, get the data that's stored on this page, read it in, and store it as an object called COVID state current. So when I press this green play button, we notice this thing pops up over here in what's called our environment window, and we'll look at that in a second. That's not the only way to run code, by the way, is this play button. I could say highlight this whole thing and go up to this run button here and click run selected lines, and it also runs it. Notice it stores up there. So this right here is what's called the environment window. When we load data, and there are other kinds of things we'll be loading, but mostly what I'm talking about in this case are spreadsheets. It gives us a little bit of information about it. So here's this data set that I've called COVID state current. It has 9,969 observations. Observations are another word for row. So it has 9,969 rows of 5 variables. Variables is another word for columns or fields, you might often hear things called. I can look at it. So in some ways, RStudio is kind of like a spreadsheet program. So if I just double click on this, it opens it up here. My text file is still here, by the way. I can get back to it. And this looks like a spreadsheet, right? It's got all of the same information that we loaded from this CSV. So it's got the date, it's got the state, it's got the unique identifier for each one, it's got cases and deaths. We'll talk more as we go through the semester about how we figure out what's the highest and what's the lowest by sorting, or looking only at a subset of data by filtering. But for those of you who have some familiarity with doing these things in, say, a program like Google Sheets, I just want to show you something cool you can do as you're exploring data. We can, say, sort all of this by date from highest to lowest. So now there's the value for Alabama on 8/30. You can sort by state just by clicking. So groups all the Alabama ones together. You can sort by cases or deaths. So if I sort by deaths, we can see that New York has had the highest number of cumulative deaths, 32,000 as of August 30th. We could also filter if I wanted to look only at a subset of data, like just for Maryland. This filters all the Maryland ones. This isn't making any permanent changes to the data. It's just a way of exploring. So many of you might know this as a spreadsheet. In R, there's a name that we'll often use called a data frame or a tibble. So when you're searching for like, how do I solve certain problems, like my spreadsheet's not working, you may not be able to find that when you search for that on the web. But if you search for data frame or tibble, that's another name for these things. Okay. So just right now, what I'd like you to do is just double click on this to open it. And mess around with it. Do some sorting, do some filtering. Just have a look. Get used to doing that in the window, and then pause, and then go ahead and come back. One other thing I want to show you here, which is like, okay, we've read in some data, but maybe it wasn't the right thing, so we want to get rid of it. Just click this broom button here. It looks like a broom, clean it up, and hit yes. It'll clear all the objects from the workspace. And then we can run it again. So we could press the play button and run it and get rid of it. Or we can click run selected lines, and it does it again. Okay. In addition to popping this up and looking at it as its own kind of entity, which is helpful for data exploration, another thing we can do is we can actually print out the data inside of our R Markdown file. And that's a nice, easy way to get a look at this. So if you remember, in this code block, I created an object called COVID state current. So I put the name of it here, and then I said, assign something to that. And what am I assigning? I'm assigning this CSV spreadsheet that I'm reading in. So now it exists up in our environment window. And now, because it exists in our environment window, we've loaded it into our environment. I can do stuff to it. So the simplest thing is I have a code block here. I'm just going to put COVID state current inside of it, which is the name of the object, and hit play. And you'll see it prints out and displays the first 10 rows. And I can cycle through those 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to the first 1,000 rows. Okay, so there's a lot more that you're going to do ultimately with R Markdown. This was just designed as a basic introduction. So go ahead and save this. So Command S, and then we are done with this portion of the lab, and we're going to move on to the next objective.